Good afternoon, everybody. I know it's been a little while since I recorded a story for you all, and I decided today that I was going to choose the story Pocahontas. I know that um, a lot of people have heard about Pocahontas and they think that she's just this wonderful person that's in the storybooks, but there's actually a real story that goes with the tale of Pocahontas. In Lincoln Charter, we actually have a little girl in kindergarten, I believe, whose name is Pocahontas. So I thought it would be fun to pull a classic tale out. The original story was written by Captain John Smith, but I got a shorter version which was adapted by Lisa Harkrader. Pocahontas, called my mother, stay here by our lodge. When my mother was not looking, I crept away to the edge of the village. I pretended to gather sticks for the fire, but I was really watching the woods. That morning, a warrior from a neighboring tribe came to talk to my father. Now everyone was talking in low voices. Something was happening, and I did not want to miss it. Warriors came out of the woods. They were leading a prisoner. It was one of the Englishmen from the strange wooden village by the sea. The prisoner was odd looking. A bush of hair sprouted from his face. His skin was pale, but he was not sick. His clothes were made of a strange animal skin, so even colored that I knew it was not deerskin. He must have been cold because he was not painted with grease to keep warm. The warriors led him to my father's lodge. My father was the most important man in our tribe. He was chief of the Powhatan and he ruled many tribes. I dropped my sticks and followed the warriors. The Englishman's name was John Smith. Father liked him. He liked the way John Smith looked him in the eye. He liked the way John Smith spoke with a strong voice. He even liked John Smith's strange tools. John Smith called one of these tools a compass. It was carved from something hard and white, which I thought was bone, but John Smith called it ivory. It was covered with a clear, flat stone that John Smith said was glass. Inside, a tiny arrow moved as if by magic. John Smith showed Father how to tell directions with it. Soon, Father decided it was time for the feast. The women of the tribe brought baskets of fish, corn, pumpkins, melons, and bread. John Smith ate until he could eat no more. After the feast, the ritual began. Father nodded, and the strongest warriors grabbed John Smith and held him down. He struggled against them. He did not understand what was happening. He thought the warriors were trying to kill him. He did not know it was a ceremony. I watched carefully because I had a part to play in the ritual. When the biggest warrior raised his war club over John Smith's head, I threw myself over the Englishman. Please, Father, spare his life, I cried. It was all part of the ceremony. The ceremony meant Father was adopting John Smith into our tribe. You will call me Father, he told John Smith, and I will call you Son. A few days later, John Smith returned to his own village. Father told us that John Smith had traveled so far from his village because he wanted to trade with us for food. His people came from far away and they did not understand what food to grow to keep them fed through the winter. His people were hungry. Father decided to send some of our people to John Smith's village with food and furs to trade. I begged him to let me go along. Please, I said, I can help. John Smith trusts me. All right, little playful one, he said. because that is what Pocahontas means. Pocahontas means playful one. It means little playful one. I hugged him and ran to join the trading party. Father almost never tells me no. He has many children, but I think I'm his favorite. We took the food and furs to John Smith's village called Jamestown. The people were glad to see us. They traded copper and tools for corn and pumpkins. I visited Jamestown often after that. Sometimes Father sent me with messages or supplies. Sometimes I went by myself. I liked the English. I played with the boys of the village. I taught them our language and they taught me theirs. My favorite Englishman, though, was John Smith. But then my people and his people stopped getting along. The Powhatans were afraid the English would try to take more land. Fighting broke out, and Father stopped sending food to Jamestown. I could not let the English starve. I sneaked food to their village. I also told them when the Powhatans planned to attack. One day, when I went to Jamestown, John Smith was not there. His people told me he had died. It made me very sad because he was my friend. The fighting between my people and the English grew worse. My father sent me to another Powhatan village to live. Jazapaws was the chief of the village and he was still friendly with the English. One day, Jazapaws told me an Englishman, Captain Argall, had sailed his ship up the river. Captain Argall had invited Jazapaws to have dinner with him aboard his ship. He wants you to come, Jazapaws said. That night, Jazapaws took me to the ship. I looked around in wonder at its size. Welcome aboard the treasurer, Captain Argall said. It was kind of you to invite me for dinner, I said. You'll be staying for longer than dinner, he said. Are you taking me prisoner? I asked. Don't think of yourself as a prisoner, said Captain Argall. You are a guest. Do you keep all your guests from leaving? I asked. You can leave as soon as your father returns the Englishman he captured. He'll do anything to keep his favorite daughter safe, the captain said. Don't worry, Pocahontas. You've been a good friend, and we'll make your stay pleasant. Jazapaws acted surprised, but he knew exactly what was happening. Captain Argall dismissed him, and when Jazapaws reached shore, one of the captain's men handed him a kettle. Jazapaws sold me to the English for a kettle. The treasurer sailed to Jamestown. Captain Argall did his best to make me feel like a guest. I was not allowed to go back to my people, but I could move about the English settlements as I pleased. I lived with Reverend Whitaker and his family. They gave me English clothes to wear and taught me to read and write. Mostly, we read the Bible. I learned about the English religion, and in some ways, it was like mine. The English had one God. The Powhatan had many gods with one chief god. Our chief God created everything just as the English believed their God did. We believed when a person died, his soul went to a wonderful place. The English called that place heaven. After a while, Father returned some of the prisoners, not all. He sent word to the English to treat his daughter well, and so I stayed. While I lived with Reverend Whitaker's family, I met John Rolfe. John Rolfe was quiet and sincere. He spoke often of his future plans. I want you to be part of my future, he told me one day. I love you, Pocahontas, and I want to marry you. When I told my father I loved John Rolfe, he agreed to the marriage. The English governor also agreed. The governor wanted peace with the Powhatan. He knew that if I married John Rolfe, my father would not attack the English. The governor said I must be baptized a Christian before John Rolfe and I could marry. It was a big step, but I believe that Reverend Whitaker had taught me. I became a Christian and took the name Rebecca. Then I became Rebecca Rolfe. Father did not come to the wedding. He was too proud, and it would have been too hard for him to see his daughter dressed in English clothes, saying English prayers, and accepting English ways. He sent some of my brothers instead. John Rolfe and I were happy together, and soon we had a son. We named him Thomas, and I loved him more than I knew was possible. When Thomas was a year old, Captain Argall and the governor of Virginia decided to sail back to England. The governor wanted me to go too. John Rolfe, Thomas, and I boarded the treasure bound for England. Others of my tribe also sailed to England, including my father's advisor, Tamakoma. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. My marriage had brought peace between the English and the Powhatan, but father was not sure it would last. He wanted to know how many English he would face if there was ever war, so he gave Tamakomo a stick. He told Tamakomo to carve a notch in the stick for each Englishman he saw in England. Poor Tamakomo. He frantically began notching his stick as soon as the ship landed, trying to make a mark for every person he saw. When we got to the shore, Tamakomo threw the stick down in disgust. If I mark a notch for every Englishman, he said, there will be no stick. Soon after we arrived, the governor said we would be presented to the court. That meant we would meet the King and Queen of England. They know you helped the Englishmen at Jamestown, John Rolfe said. They want to meet you and the other Powhatan who sailed with us. We dressed in our best English clothes and went to the lodge of the King and Queen, which was called a palace. The palace was enormous. The throne room, where the King and Queen sat, was crowded with the people. We waited until my name was called. The King and Queen asked many questions, and I told them all I could. They must have adopted me into their tribe because they took me everywhere with them. I went to plays, concerts, dinners, and balls. An artist even drew my portrait. One day I had a visitor. It was John Smith. John Smith, I exclaimed, they told me you died. I was injured and nobody expected me to survive the voyage back to England, he said, but I'm too stubborn to die. Father will be glad to know, I said, and John Smith smiled at me. I loved England, but it was hard on us. The Powhatan were not used to English diseases and damp weather. Some of my people grew sick and died. I got sick too. Home, I said to John Rolfe. I need to go home. So now we're at the epilogue of this book because it's shortened, which means that it was revised from the original author into making it a mini story so that you can get enough information in this reading in a minute way. So we're at the ending or the epilogue to this particular story. Pocahontas, who is now Rebecca, because don't forget that she was Pocahontas when she was in her Indian tribe. But when she decided to marry John Rolfe, who was an Englishman, she changed her name to Rebecca. But Pocahontas, John Rolfe, and Thomas, who is their son, left for Jamestown, but before their ship sailed very far, Pocahontas became too sick to continue. They docked in Gravesend, England, and carried Pocahontas to shore. A doctor was called, but by then it was too late. Pocahontas had died. She never returned home. I chose to utilize this particular story once again because, as many of you know, I like to merge stories to make it relatable to what we're dealing with today. And while a lot of us may be worried about what's going on in today's time frames, and sadly, there are a lot of people who are passing away because of this virus, it makes this story kind of relatable because Pocahontas, who then ends up being Rebecca, um, ends up passing away from a disease that she ends up getting and never made it home. The other part of the story that I wanted to highlight was how she left her tribe to go to become an Englishman. And the story that I believe people understand is that she married John Smith. And that's incorrect based on the story that I just read. She actually married John Rolfe, not John Smith. John Rolfe was the governor. John Smith was the Englishman who came to the tribe. However, I want you in this quiz that I'm going to post for my 4th grade team, I want you to make sure that you are paying very close attention to what is being read to you about Pocahontas. If you have to go back and rewind, please do so because I will ask those questions about what does the name Pocahontas mean. It is your job to make sure that you are going back and listening to the stories that are being read to you. You're not having to read them on your own, so it is definitely catered to those children who would prefer stories being read to them. I hope you enjoyed the story of the modified version of Pocahontas, aka Rebecca Rolfe. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that your quizzes are better than what I've seen. But so far, you've been doing pretty good. For everybody else at Lincoln Charter, I miss you guys. I hope everything is well, and I'll talk to you later.